and really excited to welcome you to today's fifth instalment of our seminar series for 2025. I'd like to kick us off by acknowledging the country that I think a lot of us would be coming from today, Ngadlu Tampanthi, Ngadlu Ghana, Yatanga Imparenti, which means that it's good that we acknowledge we're meeting on Ghana country today. And my slides would have flipped over to a lovely image of the Ghana shield to remind us all of the cultural practices that are still alive and well today. And I know that many of you online have the privilege of working with Ghana across Adelaide and doing some really exciting projects. So especially in light of Reconciliation Week last week, just a really good reminder to keep learning and growing and working together with Ghana and the people, the local people in your area if you're coming from further afield. So we run this seminar series to help share the great work happening across Adelaide to make it cooler, greener, wilder and more climate resilient. This session is being recorded and will be available on the Green Adelaide YouTube channel afterwards as well, so please spread the word with your networks. You are invited to ask questions at any time by putting them into the chat, and we'll try and answer as many of these as we can at the end of the session. And yes, no one has their mics on today, so it's a different type of webinar for you. So that's our interaction, but we look forward to answering as many of those as possible. And if we don't get to them all, we will follow up this session with an email as well. So we're very excited to talk about the flight of the Australian white ibis today with one of our very own wildlife ecologists, Dr. Liberty Olds, and we'll dive into the world of the white ibis, affectionately and a little cheekily known as the bin chicken. So this talk invites us to look beyond the stereotypes and discover the remarkable story of how these birds are adapting to life here in Adelaide. Liberty has been at the forefront of tracking and studying ibis behaviour in Adelaide and will share recent tracking study results, including Nest cameras and GPS tracking, which I'm excited to have a look at too. This will include the observation of some surprising behaviours and discussion on how these insights are helping shape future conservation and management strategies here in Adelaide. So thanks everyone for joining us, and thanks Liberty. I'll hand over to you now.
Well, thanks everyone for joining us today. Yeah, really excited to be sharing some of the work that we've been doing in Green Adelaide. The ibis are a really special bird. They're a really cool bird. But I just wanted to also acknowledge that not only is it myself doing the work, we have a range of people that are part of the project. And I've not only stolen some of their photos, but been using some of their data. And we've all been working together to pull together what is the start of a pretty interesting story for this species. So just want to acknowledge their support in some of this work to start off with. Why are we talking about ibis today? Unfortunately, we have seen an increase in them in urban areas, and they're starting to become a bit of a local nuisance and seen as a bit of a local criminal. So local councils, Green Adelaide and a range of other stakeholders are often the recipients of calls asking us how we can help to manage this species because they are causing some impact. And these impacts with our native species are a really key example of human-wildlife conflict. Often when we think about what human-wildlife conflict is, we think about situations overseas where we're seeing elephants climbing fences or, bears and things raiding crops and getting into garbage, and some really big deadly examples. In Australia, we tend to use general terms around impact causing and problematic species when we're talking about these native animals that, for whatever reason, a whole range of reasons, they're causing unwanted damage, whether that is to property, whether that is to the environment, or whether they're posing a safety or a welfare risk to people and industries. And unfortunately, a lot of these species get a really bad rap. But we do, critically recognise that this conflict is happening around us. And I'm sure many of you have avoided a magpie when it's potentially been swooping you, or you've seen ibis when you've been out and about. Ibis are a native species. There is a lot of misconception that they are an introduced species, and they were confused for a little while with the African sacred ibis, but Australian white ibis are a native species. They like to forage on prey items such as frogs and freshwater crayfish, crustaceans, earthworms, insects, all those sorts of delicious little items for them in their natural environments. And like you can see when you see them out and about, they forage by slowly walking, they peck at items on the surface, and they've evolved to have this really incredible probing bill that they can get down into the ground and down into forage into things with. They have clutches of eggs that range from 1 to 4, and these are a couple of the little chicks once they've hatched. So they've got this little black to brown down within their nests. They can hold these animals, and their nest can be either some very complex layers of vegetation and bits and pieces, or they can be some really simple, just little cups lined with sticks. So they've been very able to adapt to the changing environment. Their nesting does tend to be colonial, and that's why you often see them in really large numbers. And that's one of the reasons that it's one of the causes of their poor reputation is when you go to some of these areas and you see that all these birds are congregating together. That's often when they're breeding, and it's in one of their nesting colonies. They can also have multiple clutches per season, which means that they're really reproductively adaptable. And they have a short fledgling time, so they fledge at around 48 days. The males and females do range in their size a little bit. Females tend to be a little bit smaller, sort of 1 to 2 kilos, and the males 1.5 to 2.5 kilos. And they have this incredible wingspan that's just over 1 metre wide, and you can see that when they take flight and when you see them moving around in the sky. We actually have 3 species of ibis in Australia. I think everyone is probably most familiar with the Australian white ibis, which is the one on the left-hand side. They're the ones that we're talking about today, and they're the ones that people see most often around the city. But we have these 2 other species. The straw-necked ibis, you will sometimes see it feeding on things like irrigated ovals and in urban areas, but their range is really more around the drier pastoral areas and inland wetlands. Particularly in the southeast of Australia. And the glossy ibis, it's a much rarer species. They're significantly smaller and they don't have that same dark bill coloration, and they're a pretty important bird. So they've all suffered some changes to their natural habitat and their ranges. But for the Australian white ibis, they're probably the least fussy, potentially the least flighty. So if you were to disturb them, they are the most tolerant species, which are some of the reasons that have led to their really great success within the urban areas. Why are we seeing more ibis in the cities? It's because they've actually been dealt a pretty tough hand. And this graph here is an example from the Eastern Australian Waterbird Aerial Survey that's been undertaken annually for a long time. And the graph here you can see is the area in hectares of wetlands within the survey area. And if you look from where it started in the 1980s to more recent surveys up to 2022, the average area across those decades has really declined. And so what we've seen is there's been this reduction in natural habitat area, forcing some of these species, and particularly Australian white ibis, to move into more urban areas. So you take away the ibis habitat and they need to find somewhere else to live. And because of that adaptability, they've been able to find resources and find ways to live with the human impacts. They have now established a whole range of large permanent colonies, and you'll see them particularly around coastal sites, and I'll show you some of those shortly. But we consider them to be an urban adapter in their capacity to increase in such numbers, particularly in our urban areas. And what are we seeing in these urban areas? This is just an example of one of the breeding colonies. So you can see there's an ibis nest there, or a range of ibis nests there, where they are setting up this little colonial area. Sometimes these areas have hundreds of nests. A couple of examples we'll talk about. We have thousands of nests. And you can imagine that if you're living adjacent to one of these areas, they can get quite noisy, and they are quite raucous birds, particularly during the breeding season. Large number of birds in a fairly small and concentrated area, they can get a little bit smelly as well. These birds can also be quite bold and courageous, and they've really done a great job of adapting to using particularly our waste as a resource. And if you've ever been sitting down in cafes or in the Adelaide Zoo, you might notice that they'll even be bold enough to try and thieve some of your food whilst you're eating it. So it hasn't even made it into our waste resources yet, and they've been able to adapt. Because of this, they do have those unfortunate names, like Christy mentioned: bin chicken, tip turkey, dumpster diver. There's always new names coming up for them. I think picnic pirate was a new one that I've heard recently, which is a really unfortunate name because it's actually quite a skill and something that they should be respected for in their ability to utilise our habitat, having had us take away theirs. And I guess whilst we are seeing them all the time and we're seeing them every day, for a lot of people, we actually don't have a really good handle on how they're using our landscape. And that's really what our studies have been trying to undertake. And so why are we studying ibis? Despite them really being this publicly and well-known species, actually there has been not a great deal of research undertaken directly in South Australia. There's a lot of quantitative information of, where they might be picked up and where they're being seen, but we don't have some really great population information. So it's not really robust scientific information that we can use for making management strategies. We also need to think about some of those strategies from a coordinated approach. So understanding how they're using the landscape as a whole, not just in our backyards, is really important. And so that's what this project is really about, is understanding that landscape usage through a combination of observations, some wing tagging, and some GPS tracking. And I'll talk through some of those things today and how we're going about undertaking our project. They are a really, really neat bird, and I will say we're learning a huge amount from them already, and we're really at the infancy of our project. One of the first things that we have been doing is we have been undertaking colony surveys, and I have to shout out to Daniel, who goes and visits all of these colonies every month and does an assessment of them. And what he's looking for when he's out there is a range of information, from the number of nests to the nest activity, the age of the chicks that are in the nests, as well as their eggs and the eggs' presence, and trying to do a count of the whole number of birds. So we're trying to get a picture of, across the landscape, where these really high populous areas are and where some of the smaller colonies are. And this is giving a really good picture of their distribution. And you can see here as an example, on the top left-hand side of that picture is the colony number 3. That's Bird Island, which is just off of Outer Harbour. And there's over 1,000 ibis nests in that area. And there's a couple of other spots in the northeast and in Hills and Fleurieu where we're seeing a large proportion of nesting birds as well, around the sort of 250 mark of nests in one particular location. For us, that's really important information as we start to delve a bit deeper into why they're using these particular areas, but also from a management perspective to understand those sort of key spots within the landscape where we might be able to have some influence. The information that we've been gathering in terms of their breeding as well is really critical. So we have been taking that fledgling and nesting information. We're able to understand what's happening across time. That's a picture that I guess we've had some examples from the eastern states, but we're really learning what's happening as they're changing in that urban landscape. And you can see here a couple of the peaks of how many ibis were in a particular area, but it also gives us an idea of when the peak breeding season is. So when we're seeing more nestlings, when they're starting to lay their eggs and starting to inhabit some of those interesting areas. I mentioned that a second part of our project was to try and do some wing tagging. And that was one of the two methods that we really wanted to use to better understand the movement ecology of this species. We commenced our wing tagging project whilst we were waiting for our GPS trackers to be manufactured. They come from a company overseas, which have created some wonderful technology. And so we pursued some wing tagging to really start moving with the project. Wing tags are, I guess, a relatively cheap way of tagging birds, but they're an effective way for people to be able to be involved with the project as well. As you can imagine, ibis are scattered all over the urban landscape and we can't be everywhere at once. And so we were looking to partner with Big City Birds, which is a program run in the eastern states, to be able to engage citizen scientists to input into this distributional information that we're trying to collect. Often birds are banded on their legs, but the bird bands on legs can be really hard to see, and it's really hard to get that detailed information that we're trying to collect. So we're trying to understand, particularly around breeding, where these animals were starting off and where we were tagging them, and then where they were stopping and using resources during the day. So we started our trial with some birds, and it was really good in theory, but turns out ibis are smarter than us. So we used some fairly standard trapping methods that you would expect. We put out food, we prepared the traps, we free-fed them for a while, they were interacting with them. And then when it came to actually trapping, the ibis used their piercing glare and they stared at us. And we only caught a handful of animals using the methods that we had planned on initially using. So they are really, really smart birds. They're really trap shy. They pick up on each other's behaviours, and they pose some challenges that we perhaps weren't expecting right at the outset of our project. And I can tell you, when you go back into the office and you tell people that you have spent the whole day trying to trap an ibis, and you have come up stumps, it's a very hard day. So we have also been in contact with our colleagues in the eastern states, and they certainly made us feel a bit better in that they have also had challenges trapping these birds as well. They are very smart birds. So for our citizen science project and for our wing tagging project, we really wanted to have a large number of birds as part of that. And so we felt it wasn't the right time to be pursuing that project. And I will say watch this space, because we pursued doing GPS tracking, which I'll talk about in a second, but that GPS tracking, we're able to really start to use that information to prioritise some areas where we'll be able to potentially do some wing tagging in the future. There are some birds out there, obviously, with wing tags still. This is number one. He hangs out at Adelaide Zoo most of the time, but we are actively working with Big City Birds as well. So if you do see one of these birds that has a wing tag on them, feel free to jump onto the Big City Birds app and record it, because we're still really interested in these animals. But we've temporarily parked our wing tagging for the moment. All right, my slide's just taking a second to change across. So we've been pursuing doing some GPS tracking, and I'll just talk about tracking for a second a little bit for those of you that haven't heard about it before. The traditional tracking methods that are used for animals have generally relied on VHF transmitters, a bit like the transmitters that you have in your antenna, which are UHF, but a similar system. You use an antenna to talk to a unit. So the antenna receives a signal from the transmitter. You can then go to different locations to try and triangulate what that location is of the transmitter. And so in that example on the left-hand side, someone with that antenna has been standing at the point where it says receiver A, and they've been able to detect a signal. They've moved to the point where it says receiver B, and they've been able to detect a signal, and they've moved around to the point receiver C. They've then collated that information to say, well, when I was facing this direction, I picked up the signal. When I was at B, I was facing this direction, I picked up the signal. And so they can do what's called triangulation to work out the point of that tag. It takes a lot of time in the field, and it can be quite challenging, particularly if you're working in large areas, to try and try and detect these sorts of signals. But if you look at some of the sort of historical videos and things and pictures of people, and they talk about doing radio tracking, and it still has really great relevance for a lot of species today. You often see people running around with antennas trying to work out where these animals are hanging out. Technology has obviously changed quite significantly, and now we're able to use similar systems to what our mobile phones do to track animals. So we fit a GPS receiver device to the animal, and in a similar way that the VHF technology used to be used to triangulate where the animals were, we use the GPS satellite information to do that triangulation for us. The trackers that we've been using also use a GSM technology. So the technology that your phone uses to send text messages and to make phone calls, we use that to communicate that satellite data backwards and forwards. So it's totally changed, I guess, the landscape of how we're able to track animals. And just a couple of really cool examples here before we delve into ibis is, you know, this technology is really quite incredible. And an example here of one of the extremes of some of the information that's been found out is this on the left-hand side is a bar-tailed godwit, labelled B6. And B6 set out a new world record. It was fitted with a tracker, satellite tracker, and it undertook a migration between Alaska to Tasmania over 11 days, 13,500 kilometres it travelled. So that is a huge trip. I think it's the longest trip so far that's been documented non-stop by any animal. And look at the size of the animal. Absolutely incredible. So without being able to use this technology, we would have had no concept that these birds are doing such extraordinary flights. On the right-hand side, we have the opposite of the extreme. So we have a little bumblebee here. And this bumblebee is being used for research by the University of Washington. And you can just see underneath the wings on the back of that bumblebee that it has a tiny little tracker that's been attached to it. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to understand the bees' movements across crops and look at seasonality to help farmers yield better crops. So two really great extremes of how our technology has changed and why we've been pursuing GPS trackers for the Australian white ibis. So for our tracking project, we picked 4 key colonies that we wanted to work with, and the information for these colonies and choices really came from some of that data that we've been collecting monthly on the breeding and the sizes of these colonies and some of their behaviours. Across the 4 locations of Bird Island, Windvale Dam, Roy Amer Reserve and Adelaide Zoo. And some of you might be familiar with a number of these locations. Bird Island is one of the largest colonies that we're aware of in South Australia, and that's where that big over 1,000 nests were earlier in the image. And this is a picture of what the ibis look like on Bird Island. They're actually using boxthorn for their nesting, so they are very resourceful and resilient birds. Bird Island is a short digging trip off the coast, and we set about our tracking project to go and start there. Being one of the biggest colonies, we thought we would have a reasonable chance of success after our experience trying to trap them for our tagging project. We went over to Bird Island, and I can tell you it was an epic fail. They basically had no interest in the food that we were providing them with. We carted all of our traps over, but it didn't make any difference. They really weren't motivated or have any interest in what we were offering them. And we learned something really interesting, that this is really likely just a breeding colony. The birds, once they're over there and once they've moved in, they spend their time there looking after their young and setting about their breeding business, and that they weren't particularly interested in food, and they go and find their resources elsewhere. So we couldn't tempt them. And this was definitely one of those career questioning moments, I think, after a couple of trips to Bird Island. We obviously had some success, and we looked at other locations and trialled some different trapping methods and used the bird's behaviour to try and find some ways that we're able to have some success. And this is an example out at Royaima Reserve, where we have watched where the birds were using the habitat, and they were particularly engaging with certain spots in the grasses, and we were able to lay some little noose traps around there, and we sit and we watch those traps very carefully, and we go and remove those birds as soon as they've been caught. But like we found when we were doing trapping across the other locations, we really had to change our expectations for what we were setting out to do. And these birds are very smart, and as soon as 1 or 2 birds had been trapped, they, I think, became quite savvy to it and were less willing to go into those areas. So it meant that when we're thinking about our trapping efforts and our trapping days, we would expect that we might only get 1 or 2 birds at a particular location, and we would then go and move to somewhere else and think about a different site. So a lot of learning along the way, which is a really important part of research. We have obviously had some success, which is fantastic, and we have had some really interesting results, which is very cool. The process for attaching trackers to the birds, we have a whole range of equipment that we use for it. Once we have the birds trapped, we make sure that they're safe and we look after their welfare very, very carefully. Often we're working in public spaces, and so we do have things like pet packs to make sure that they're protected and people are aware that there are animals around us. And then we're able to take a range of measurements from the birds. So whilst we have these birds in hand, it's really important that we're gathering as much information as we can. As much as they might seem like a really common bird, all of this information starts adding to the story and improves our understanding of their biology and their morphometrics. And so once we have the birds, we start to take a few measurements. We measure their bills, and you can use their bill length to determine whether they're a male or a female. We also take some weight measurements and things like that. Now, it looks like this bird might be, he's got his eyes covered. The covering on the eyes is actually just a little sock. And what that does is that it tries to really help calm the birds when they have their eyes covered and protected. And you can see here the bird's sitting quite calmly. So we try and process the animals as quickly as we possibly can and reduce the amount of stress that the birds are under. These are our GPS tracking units. They're a little bit different to the units that were attached to the godwits, and obviously quite different to the units that were attached to bumblebees. These units are a GPS unit that talk to the mobile phone network, so the GSM network. They have their limitations for certain projects. Because they use the GSM network, it means that they need to be in range to be able to transmit the data, but they have a huge memory capacity, so they can keep storing and storing and storing data until they come into range, and then they send all that data to the central unit. But for ibis, we know that they're spending a lot of the time, or we assume they were spending a lot of the time in that urban area, so we're fairly confident that they would have a good connection with the mobile phone network. What you can see on the back there is a little solar panel. So it is quite intensive on a battery to be taking GPS points. It's more intensive to be sending that data and transmitting that data. So that little solar panel enables the battery unit to continuously be recharging. And that's a really important part of the project for us, is to try and get that long-term data for this species. So see how they're moving across the year and across time. These units are attached with a little backpack. They're individually fitted. So just like us, when you put a backpack on that someone else has been wearing, you adjust the straps a little bit to make sure that it's nice and comfortable for you. We do the same for each individual bird, and then we stitch those straps to themselves. So the unit itself isn't stitched to the bird or anything like that. It's just like a little backpack unit. And they're surprisingly very, very sturdy. And from all the trackers that we've attached to the animals, we've had really, really great success. So we now have 16 trackers attached to birds. Those animals have been across 4 different locations, so Windvale Dam, Adelaide Zoo, Royaima, and Bird Island. And these trackers, we're getting tracks from them every 5 to 30 minutes. And the reason why that varies is we're able to control the settings on these trackers. So it means that they're battery dependent. So if they have a really good battery and it's been really, really sunny and they've been able to charge, they'll take a track every 5 minutes. if the battery's starting to be a bit depleted, they can self-manage that and they won't use as much battery to take that information. So it might drop down to every 30 minutes. What that means, though, is that given we've had trackers on 16 ibis for over a year now, we have a huge amount of data, and it's quite incredible the success that we've had with these trackers. We've been very fortunate in the information that we've been getting, and they've fitted the birds really well as well. So we've been, very, very happy with how we've been going so far, and just starting to delve into some of the information that we're getting. And so I'll share with you a couple of little stories today. I won't go into all of the information because we're also still working really hard to try and do the statistics around it. We certainly were, I think, overwhelmed with the amount of data that we have received, which is absolutely fantastic, but we want to make sure we're making the best use of it. One of the examples that we'd like to share is one from Windvale Dam. And from here, you can see this is a picture of Windvale Dam if you're not familiar with it. It's in the northeast of northeast of Adelaide, and it is a little area where there is this island. And this island is a really great nesting spot for the ibis. They are protected from foxes because they have a little water body around them. There's trees in there. There's food accessible nearby, and they've done a really good job of setting up a little breeding colony here. And so we've tagged 5 birds from Windvale Dam, and they're all doing slightly different things. For us, they're, I think, a really great example of why we need to think about this species and how it moves across the landscape and how it uses the landscape, and how scale is really important for when we're thinking about management action. So there's Windvale Dam there, and this is Windvale Dam in the context of the region. So Windvale Dam is just in that little pin. Windvale Dam itself, the little area is only about 200 square metres. So when we think about one bird that we've put a tracker on, this is the sort of area that they've been covering. So each one of those dots, and there are thousands of them overlaid there, but they give you a bit of a picture of just how far this particular bird has been moving. So from that little small 200 square metre patch, this bird's already covering a fair bit of area, which is really interesting. And we start adding in some more birds, and this particular bird has gone for a little adventure. It's taken a weekend trip. It's actually gone out to the big rocking horse, made a few stops along the way, and then made its way back to Windvale Dam. We add in a third bird. This is doing a few different things as well. Started to take some tracks and headed out and use some of the areas slightly more north. We have a fourth bird that's really doing something completely different. And so with just 4 birds, we're already seeing that what we would consider to be potentially a colony out at Windvale Dam, those birds are already interacting across all 4 locations that we put trackers on individuals, which is a really important learning for us. Add in a 5th bird, and this is the 5 birds that we have trackers on from Windvale Dam. And again, it's showing some really different movements. This bird has headed down south and is using a really larger proportion of our urban landscape in South Australia. Another really interesting example, this is not a bird from Windvale Dam. This is a male, also known as 224625. We probably need a bit of a better naming system than that, but he has been a little bit more adventurous across the last year or so. So he was tagged up at Bird Island off the shore near North Haven there, and he's really done a lot of movement. He's moved obviously north, but he's gone right down into the Coorong. Not only has he gone down into the Coorong, he's also turned around and gone back again and headed back up to Bird Island. So this is the longest movement that we've recorded to date, bearing in mind that this is only of the 5 birds that were at Windvale, of the 16 birds that we've put trackers on so far. Another example is some of the birds that we put trackers on at Adelaide Zoo, and this is quite contrasting and obviously a bit more zoomed in. We can see here of some of their tracks, but the birds that we looked at Adelaide Zoo really haven't ventured that far, and to some extent it's unsurprising because they probably haven't needed to. There is an abundance of food source nearby. There's chicken nuggets, and they're quite happy to, I think, steal them from toddlers or from anyone who's going to offer them to them. But there's also animal leftovers and so forth. So there is an ongoing resource right in their perfect breeding habitat. And this is a really good example of where we need to be really thinking about that context of the situation and the management implications for what we're undertaking. And so if we overlay, this is the tracks from all 16 birds, and we haven't done detailed analysis of where these tracks have gone. We are able to look at those movements when they've moved from one location to another and in what order and across what time frame, but we're really just starting to scratch the surface. But hopefully you can really see why scale is really important when we're thinking about our management implications for doing these things. You know, the bird that might be chasing you down at the local supermarket or that you're seeing in your local park may actually be roosting 5, 10, 20 kilometres away and is interacting with the habitat and the landscape over thousands of kilometres. So just across these handful of birds is about 2,000 square kilometres of area that these birds are using. So that scale is really important. We haven't seen any extensive large movements to date. So in the eastern states, they have been found to move across states from Queensland through to Victoria. There's some really great studies happening across those areas. But a lot of the focus has been on other species such as straw-necked ibis and really more natural habitats so that they can understand how they're using those habitats and what areas need to be protected over time and where the water and environment needs to be supporting their foraging and their persistence and their natural behaviours. So we still really have a huge amount of learning to do across their distribution. And I think we're really making a great start with some of the tracking that we've been doing. But it's not just about that distributional information. We are able to look at how they're using the landscape within those tracks and collate that information together. I will say that this is just a bit of a draft because we are working through the statistics and how to do it best. But we can understand a little bit more about their behaviour and some of the things like the key land use categories. So where are they using? Are they using residential areas? Are they using waste? This graph here is an example where it's colour coded for the different land use categories, and you can see how that land use changes over time. So what's that looking like across the breeding seasons and the non-breeding seasons? And that really influences how we understand the species and how they're using the landscape and potentially how best to help with their management and how to protect them in some spaces and potentially encourage them into others. So all of the work is coming together to really look at these best management outcomes. I think this is a really good example of how it does change over time, and you can see particularly, for instance, in the month of August, there was a focus on residential areas and they've been using those particular areas. As they become potentially more resource intensive, they're shifting what they're using to some of the waste facilities and things like that. So we're able to look at those tracks and classify the areas where they're stopping. We are looking at lots of other ways that we can cut the data to kind of have a deeper dive. And like I said, we're really in the infancy of doing some of this, but this is just some examples to show you of how we're using it. In figure A, it's an example of one of the ibis, number 13, over a period of time, and hopefully it comes up on your screen, but there's a whole series of grey dots, and they're those individual tracking dots. We're able to analyse those dots and look at the areas that they're revisiting frequently. And so in graph B, in figure B, you can see those little red areas, and you can just see the edges of them up in A, but really focus in on them in B. And those red dots represent locations, even just in those small areas, where they're actually revisiting sites for over 35% of their time. So they're really key areas of really high visitation. And so we can start to see what they're particularly targeting and how they're using those areas. And because of the frequency of a lot of the data that we're collecting, when those batteries are working really well and we're getting information every 5 minutes, we can look at that at a really fine scale. So some really cool information that's coming out. We can also look at those repeat visitation areas and start to understand some of the hotspots. And this is just an example out near, it's Parafield Airport, where there's potentially colonies starting to form, and there's areas of high usage that might pose a risk to safety for people, or bird strike risk, or there's areas of community concern. And this is an example of that sort of really clustered heat mapping that we can do. And we can do that for individual birds, but we can also do that by collating all of the data together and looking at the whole group of birds as a whole. So some really critical information that we're starting to gather, and yeah, getting a really interesting picture for what the ibis are really doing. The focus of these in-depth studies will be working with the university to try and get those statistics happening. We are really hoping to be able to put some more trackers on birds, and we'll be able to use some of this data to determine where we should be putting those, which colonies we should be targeting, whether we should be looking at the areas that we've already been working in, or whether we should be looking at some more rural areas. It might be that the more rural areas and birds in those areas are behaving somewhat differently to what we're seeing in the urban areas. A bit like what we're seeing in South Australia is somewhat different to what's happening in the eastern states. So there's a whole body of really critical information that we are still hoping to collect. So they're the main next phases of the project, is really getting those stats together and doing that assessment. So looking at the information that we've got, those trackers on those 16 birds are still collecting data. So they've been going for over a year, and they will keep going hopefully for years to come. So we've been really happy with the technology that they've been using and their ability to recharge. We can change their settings remotely, like I mentioned, but it also means that we can have a look at their battery and change settings according to their battery capacity and how that's changing. So we can really maximise the longevity of the information that we're getting. They are starting to tell a bit of a story about the connectedness. And if you think about the picture of all of those little locations, when we start talking about ibis, we talk about these colonies and the sort of nesting locations. But in actual fact, most of those birds have probably encountered each other at least once in their lives, or been in a very similar place, and have these overlapping ranges, which I think is a misconception that we really have, is that the ibis that you're seeing in your backyard are really, restricted to that local area. Because of all of the information that we've been collecting, we're going to have a look at some of those additional locations, and we're going to continue to work with our interstate counterparts to try and understand what's happening over there and really relate that to what we're finding over here. But hopefully in time, we'll be able to share some of these learnings and really set some novel and some innovative ways to think about how we can better manage some of these species. A lot of new developments are bringing in things like palm trees and water areas, and you're often creating perfect environments for ibis to come in and utilise those areas. And then down the track, you have concerns about the impact they're having on the community. So we need to think a little bit more about our management targets and how we're influencing what things look like into the future. In the short term, what can we do? Well, they are labelled bin chickens for a reason. And I think that whilst they are really, really cool birds and they're doing all of these incredible things, some of the small things that we can do are actually in our own backyards and bins are probably a really good place to start. If you don't want to encourage birds or wildlife to be coming into these spaces, we need to be thinking a bit smartly about how we're living them and take some responsibility for what we're doing as well. So things like closing our bins off or using bird-friendly and wildlife-friendly bins can certainly help these guys out. Then we also need to think about these guys from a different perspective. They are very, very clever animals. They're very adaptable, and hopefully from some of the pictures you've seen, you've been able to see just how well they're using our landscape and how smart they have been. And, they do get a bad rap. There is still that misconception, like I said, of them being an African species, that they're not meant to be here, because they have increased in abundance over the last 20 to 30 years and potentially increasing as we see them. So because we're seeing them more, they're often considered a pest species, but we need to change that narrative to some extent. They're here because we have changed and modified their habitat, and they're really adaptable. And recognise them and respect them for the skills that they have. So a lot of information in there, and we're really hoping to be able to share more in the coming years and get people involved with some citizen science projects. But yeah, a bit of watch this space, but hopefully you've got a bit of a different idea on how ibis are using our area and how cool and amazing these magnificent birds actually are. They're not always covered in little brown and bits of rubbish from their visits into the bins and local areas, that they are actually a native species that naturally lived in our wetlands and our area. So hopefully at some point we can see a few ibises on people's mantles. Sorry, I think my slides have got stuck again, but we can open to questions.
Awesome. Fantastic. Yes, I love the ibis on the mantles. Yeah. Awesome. We've got a few questions here, and I also love the idea that they're urban adapters, and as all of us are really adapting to living in the city, and we're all learning about how to do that. So lots to learn from birds as well. This is a good question. I think you started to answer a little bit of this, but as urban greening practitioners, is there anything we should not do in terms of, build, implement or plant because it would harm this particular species? Or you could frame that the other way. What are some things that we could think about in developing?
Yeah, absolutely. And, increasingly we're seeing biodiversity sensitive design being a really important part of development and how we're thinking about the urban landscape. That's one of the key areas that Green Adelaide is interested in working towards. I wouldn't say it's necessarily, in terms of what we should not do, you think about the bird's ecology. And like I mentioned, they are very savvy in how they're using the landscape. They are able to avoid predators by, nesting in protected areas, and they do like using things like palms. If you drive down Port Road, you'll see a lot of them all using the palm trees down there. So we are doing a good job of creating habitat for them. Yeah.
Awesome. And some surprising habitat as we do as well. But just thinking about the ecology as you plan whatever greening project you're working on. Awesome. And this question, I was just trying to work out exactly how it was framed. But how many do we? I suppose it's a question around how many white ibis we have in Adelaide comparatively to other cities and that kind of thing. Do you have any sense of if we've got larger numbers here, or anything from your colleagues interstate?
Yes, I think the largest estimates have been around the sort of Sydney city centres, but that's one of the challenges with tracking birds and understanding. And when you look at some of those maps and the scale, is that in one day you could be counting a bird in a particular area, and you drive to another area the next day and you're counting that same bird, because they are very good at moving between these spaces. So getting a really good handle on exact numbers of most bird species can be exceptionally challenging.
Yeah, such a important thing to highlight, that it's not as easy as it looks, that's for sure. And in terms of, this is another great question from Tina. What happens to the tracker at the, end of the bird's life, or the end of the tracker's life? I suppose you'll come to that. How long are they staying on for? What's the plan?
Yeah, so the intention is that these are a permanent tracker. They're a backpack that is fitted really well to the animals. So we do take a lot of time and care to make sure that the fit is really good. And if we're not comfortable, we won't fit them. But these particular trackers haven't really been used on ibis before. There's some trackers that have records for other species that have lasted 20 years. So as the technology is changing, we can have, really long lifespans. Part of that design in having the GPS unit on it means that we can monitor them to really make sure that we're getting as much of the lifespan of the trackers as we can.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, and I had a cheeky question as well, kind of relates to that, but and you may have mentioned it at the start, but in terms of how long do the birds actually usually live for? What's their usual life? Because I suppose that then affects them.
The estimates are probably sort of between the 10 to 20 years. It depends on the individual birds and their health. They are a reasonably long, I guess a long-lived species in that sense. Yeah.
So a little bit more than your usual chicken, that's for sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah. So very adaptable. And yes, you started kind of mentioning a bit around the narrative, and I suppose that's with the potential for citizen scientists to get involved in the future, that might help as well. But is there anything that we can all do to help support, kind of shift that narrative around the bird?
Yeah, I think it is really important to recognise that they are a native species. And as much as the bin chicken is a terrible name for them, it can be used as an opportunity to help raise that awareness. And if you look at most species, most native species, a lot of people have never heard of them, but there's children's books and there's T-shirts, and the ibis is actually absolutely everywhere. And so we have to really make that as much of an opportunity as we can, to not have the negative connotation of a bin chicken, and celebrate the species.
Yeah, totally. I do like the dumpster diver, because that's kind of like creative. We've got human dumpster divers as well as bird dumpster divers. So that kind of takes it a little bit longer. But having the quirky name for them, I suppose, does help at least people to talk about them, and gives you a way in when you're talking to people, and so that when there's other options for people that wouldn't even know their true name as well. So
so I think
everyone get out there with an ibis shirt and promote the amazing urban adapters. Definitely. And this one is a bit of a broader question in terms of just a bit more understanding about the role that the ibis plays in our ecosystem. Like, do they keep other species in check? Do they support other species, or or do they just do a good job of cleaning up after us?
Well, they do that now. But historically, they do have a really important role. And if you look at particularly in the eastern states, I think it's the straw-necked ibis, and to some extent, I think the Australian white ibis. They've actually been called the farmer's friend, because they have really assisted with controlling things like agricultural pests and stuff. So they do have an important role in the ecosystem. It's just that we've done a really good job of modifying what that ecosystem looks like.
Yeah, and so through this, finding out how they're then adapting and modifying the urban ecosystem. So that's why studies like this are really important as well. And in terms of the study itself, Liv, do we have an idea in terms of how long the study is going to continue for in Adelaide?
Yeah, so we do have more trackers that we will try and put out hopefully this season, this year, and look at some of those priority sites. And then I think we'll reassess the information that we're getting from them. We obviously don't want to be putting trackers out unnecessarily into the environment and working with the birds. So we want to, make really great use of the information that we're getting in. But they are a species that is going to be living in our urban environment for a long time. So they're always going to be, I think, of interest to us.
Yeah, awesome. Fantastic. Great. Oh, there's one other one coming through now. And yeah, I did share the link with everyone to the Big City Birds app, which I know is not something that people can add into quite yet, but just for interest's sake in terms of seeing how other projects and other cities are looking at birds as well. Awesome.
Yeah, and the data in that Big City Birds app, we are working with the other researchers on that project. And so if you have a look in that app, you'll see that there's a number of other species in there as well. So there is the capacity, if you do happen to see a wing-tagged ibis, to get that information in there, and we'll certainly hear about it if you do.
Yeah, yeah. And there's no chance of that being linked with the GPS data in the future? Is that, yeah, I suppose technology is shifting, and yeah, how things link with apps. I wouldn't even fathom how that all works, but
yeah, no,
I'm sure someone's coming up with something innovative.
There are some platforms that GPS data is loaded into. Our current IBIS data isn't loaded into it, but you can, if you're interested in that sort of thing, you can go onto MoveBank, and it is an international platform where raw data is loaded. So for some projects, people have these trackers out and the data doesn't even go straight to the researchers. It goes straight onto this platform. It's unedited, so you have to sort of think about what you're looking at. But you can actually jump onto MoveBank and have a look at what species are doing. All sorts of different species are doing all over the world. So yeah, technology is changing. We're getting more and more platforms that we can use for information sharing, which is fantastic.
Awesome. Yeah, well, we'll share that links to those platforms and other things for people to go on much deeper dives, and I'm sure we'll update you all as the project moves along through all of Green Adelaide's platforms. So thank you so much for your time today, Liv, and pulling that together in your busy week of lots of field trips and looking after lots of different species as well. So yeah, it was really fascinating. So thank you so much. And to everyone online, thank you for joining us this evening. And our next webinar in the series will be in July on the importance of protecting and supporting grassland ecosystems across Adelaide. You'll receive an invitation to that one as well. And of course, you can catch up on all of the webinar series on our YouTube channel at any time as you're driving to work, as you're coming home. So thanks so much for joining us, and everyone have a wonderful evening. Keep in touch.